St. Mark's, may the peace of Christ be with you all. If you are joining us for the first time this morning, we are in a brand new liturgical season, and that is the season of Lent, which is a 40-day period of time for preparation for Easter Sunday. During this season, the spiritual emphasis is to walk more closely with Jesus Christ, and oftentimes the church kicks off this season by looking at the 3 temptations that Jesus faced after the 40 days in the wilderness. For this year's Lenten season, instead of doing a sermon series on the 3 temptations, I want to do a sermon series on the 7 deadly sins, and last week we kicked off the series by looking at our first deadly sin, which was the sin of pride. If you missed last week, the sin of pride can quickly best be described as when we feel superior to others or we feel better than others because of something we possess, whether it's a talent, a skill, or some kind of a material possession, and that causes us to look down on others as if they are less worthy. The parable we looked at last week, which illustrated the sin of pride, was the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, where the Pharisee clearly thought of himself better than the tax collector. I also shared my own sin of pride, the story of my flight to Paris, how I was sitting in the premium blue section and looked down on everyone sitting behind me in the coach section. So that was last Sunday where we looked at the sin of pride. This morning we turn to the next deadly sin, and that is the sin of envy. The sin of envy. The sin of envy is often listed as the second sin right after the sin of pride, because if you are prone to the sin of pride, envy is not far behind. In fact, some people have said the sin of pride gives birth to the sin of envy. What does that look like? What does that mean? Let's use the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector as a quick example. The source of pride for the Pharisee was that he was an exceptional Pharisee, and to his credit, he fasted twice a week. He gave a tenth of all he had. On top of that, he was at the temple praying. He was doing what some people call the 3 pillars of Lent: praying, fasting, almsgiving, or charity, good works. The only problem was, being a good Pharisee, that all went to his head, and his pride turned into a sinful pride because he looked down on others, especially that tax collector. The Pharisee even had the gall to stand up in front of everyone so that everyone could see and hear him, almost as if he was saying, without saying, "Look at me. I'm better than that guy, that tax collector." That's the sin of pride. But pretend for a moment that the parable introduced a third character. Pretend while this was all going on, yet another Pharisee entered the temple, and when he stood up to pray, this is how he prayed. "God, I thank you that I am not like other Pharisees. I fast not twice a week, but 3 times a week, and I give not 10%, but 11% of all I get. And after this Pharisee and this tax collector go home for the day, I'm going to spend a few more hours here and pray until the sun goes down." That's not how the parable went, but just pretend for a moment and try to imagine now, what do you think this first Pharisee felt after hearing what the second Pharisee said all of that? It was no longer pride, it was now envy. That's how pride gives birth to envy. Let's pause for a moment so I could share a quick definition of envy. According to the Oxford Dictionary, the noun form of the word envy is a feeling of discontented or resentful longing aroused by someone else's possessions, quality, or luck. The verb form of envy is to desire to have a quality, possession, or other desirable attribute belonging to someone else. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines envy as a painful or resentful awareness of an advantage enjoyed by another, joined with a desire to possess the same advantage, and that discontented feeling that arises in the selfish heart in view of the superiority of another, whether real or imagined, nearly tantamount to jealousy. To use the word envy in a sentence: my neighbor's new lawnmower has given me a bad case of lawnmower envy. Here's another one. All the ballerinas were green with envy for the role given to Sarah. So on the front cover of your worship bulletins, we want to show you, again, the famous painting by Hieronymus Bosch. We have a picture of it here on the screen. This is the picture of his famous 7 deadly sins. And the panel that depicts envy is in the 8 o'clock-ish position. Here's a close-up of that panel. It's too small in your bulletin, so we blew it up for you to see on the screen. And in this panel, it shows a storefront with 3 people working inside the little store and 3 people outside, their customers. The customer to the far right is walking away with a sack of purchased items. The customer sort of in the middle has just purchased a falcon sitting on his hand. And the customer to the left is waiting to buy something still. Then there are 2 dogs in the picture down below. They're looking at a bone in the man's hand. They're supposedly fighting over it, even though there are 2 bones right between them. This is supposed to show envy. It's kind of an older idea of this image, this word. Dogs fighting over bones, and customers making unnecessary purchases just because someone else did. The word on the bottom of this panel is the word invidia. Invidia is a Latin word translated to look at with malice. Okay. Now, the Bible is full of examples of the sin of envy. One of the earliest examples is the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. Found a picture that shows Joseph's family tree. And let me begin by saying it's a very unconventional picture, to say the least. Can we show the next picture? So Joseph's father, who was not in this picture, was a man named Jacob, and Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, who were sisters. Leah is the one on the far left in the red. Rachel is the third one in light blue. And the 2 wives were sisters, and among them, Rachel was the favorite. The other 2 women in the picture were the sisters' servants, Zilpah in the yellow and Bilhah in the green. So Jacob had children with all 4 of these women: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, all from Leah. Gad and Asher from Zilpah. Joseph and later Benjamin from Rachel. And finally, Dan and Naphtali from Bilhah. But among all these children, guess who was Jacob's favorite of all these children? It was Joseph. And I don't know if you could see, but Joseph is the one in the blue, and he's kind of got this angelic look. That's because he's got that robe of many colors on. To tell you how much Jacob favored Joseph, again, he's wearing that special robe of many colors, and kind of interesting how they've shown it here on this family tree. On top of all this, while all the other brothers had to work hard in the fields, Joseph lounged around the home wearing his Technicolor dream coat. So, guess what his brothers were feeling? Naturally, they were feeling envious. And the sin of envy motivated them to sell Joseph into slavery. Genesis chapter 37, verse 11, Joseph's brothers were envious and jealous of him. The Amplified Bible translation. That's one of the easiest examples of jealousy. Another example of the sin of envy was King Saul and how he felt towards younger David. 1 Samuel 18, verse 5 through 9. I don't have a verse on screen. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, and with tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. It's an interesting way to phrase it. Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Envy caused King Saul to take many attempts on young David's life. Saul wanted what David had, which was the praises of the people, but because he couldn't get it, he wanted to make it so that David couldn't get it either. So these two examples of envy from the Bible highlight one of the characteristics in regards to sin. Envy is a sin we experience in close proximity with others. Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish theologian and philosopher who wrote extensively about the sin, he called the sin of envy a small-town sin. Envy is the sin that is the byproduct of living in close proximity with others, where we are constantly tempted to compare ourselves with other people. It's the sin between siblings like Joseph and his brothers. It's the sin between father and son-in-law like Saul and David. It's the sin among best friends. It's the sin among colleagues. It's the sin among next-door neighbors. Now, when I was studying this topic earlier in the week, I was often getting it confused with other sins like coveting or jealousy or greed, and so I want to know what the distinctions are. They're very similar, but there's very subtle distinctions. Let me explain the distinction using this hypothetical situation. Let's say one morning you step outside the house to fetch the morning newspaper, and there in your neighbor's driveway is a brand new Porsche. The sin of coveting says, if my neighbor has a new Porsche, then I want a new Porsche too. And so you go out and buy a Porsche, and both of you have Porsches in your driveway. That's the sin of coveting. The sin of greed says, that Porsche is a nice car. I don't have a Porsche yet, but I do have a Mercedes, a Ferrari, a BMW, a Lamborghini, and a Porsche will make a great addition to my extensive car collection. But the sin of envy is unique. It says, that's a nice Porsche. Why does he have a Porsche? I wish I had a Porsche instead of him. Maybe a Porsche is not a good example. How about this one? Your best friend shows you a picture of her new boyfriend, but her new boyfriend causes you to struggle inside. If you're struggling with the sin of coveting, when you see her new boyfriend, you want a boyfriend too. If you're struggling with the sin of greed, when you see her new boyfriend, you don't want just one boyfriend, you want 10 boyfriends. But if you're struggling with the sin of envy, you don't want one boyfriend, you don't want 10 boyfriends. What do you want? You want her boyfriend. That's the sin of envy. You want what is theirs, and you want it for yourself, and you wish they didn't have it. I wish I had his car. I wish I had her boyfriend. I wish I had his praises of 10,000. I wish I had his Technicolor dream coat. Now that we are all experts on the sin of envy, let's look at a story Jesus told about people who struggled with this sin. Jesus once told a parable that illustrates the sin of envy, and in that parable he told us how this sin begins and also how to deal with it. The parable is called the parable of the workers in the vineyard, told in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. In the Message translation, which I'll be reading, the parable is called A Story About Workers. Please follow along on the screen above me. Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16. Hear God's word for us today. God's kingdom is like an estate manager who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. They agreed on a wage of $1 a day and went to work. Later, around 9 o'clock, the manager saw other men hanging around the town square unemployed. He told them to go to work in his vineyard and he would pay them a fair wage. They went. He did the same thing around noon and again at 3 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, he went back and found still others standing around. He said, "Why are you standing around all day doing nothing?" They said, "Because no one has hired us." He told them to go work in his vineyard. When the day's work was over, the owner of the vineyard instructed his foreman, "Call the workers in and pay them their wages, starting with the last hired and go on to the first." Those hired at 5 o'clock came and were each given $1. When those who were hired first saw that, they assumed they would get more, but they got the same, each of them $1. Taking the $1, they groused angrily at the manager. "These last workers put in only 1 easy hour, and you have just made them equal to us who slaved all day under a scorching sun." He replied to the one speaking for the rest, "Friend, I haven't been unfair. We agreed on the wage of $1, didn't we? So take it and go. I decided to give to the one who came last the same as you. Can't I do what I want with my own money? Are you going to get stingy because I am generous?" Here it is again, the great reversal. Many of the first ending up last, and the last first. This is the word of the Lord. What's interesting about the parable of the workers in the vineyard is that it shows us a few things about the sin of envy. First, the sin of envy is one we commit not in isolation or when we're all by ourselves, but when we're with others, especially those who are our peers. In the case of the parable, the first worker envied the last worker, and while one worked more than the other, they were from the same station in life. So, workers envy other workers. Kings envy other kings. Siblings envy other siblings. Athletes envy other athletes. Monks envy other monks. This is where the sin of envy resides. We envy our peers, not so much those who are above our station, nor those who are below our station. So obviously, I'm not envious of someone like Bill Gates. We're not on the same level. I also do not envy someone like Tom Cruise. We're nowhere in the same ballpark. But who I find myself envious of are actually other clergy members and other pastors. Those are my peers. The first hour worker was envious of the last hour worker. He wasn't envious of the landowner or the foreman. He was envious of his peer. Last Sunday, when I shared where the 7 deadly sins came from, I explained how this list of 7 sins came from a monastic community, basically a group of monks who were living out in the desert. And oftentimes in these communities, everyone is considered equal, but this is exactly where the sin of envy does its most damage because of its ability to destroy fellowship and tight communities. Oscar Wilde, an Irish poet and a playwright, once told this fictional story about how the devil was crossing the Libyan desert. The The devil came upon a spot where a small number of demons were torturing and tormenting this monk, but all their efforts had no effect, for the monk easily shook off every single temptation. The devil watched as the group of monks failed at every attempt. The monk would not easily be swayed, so the devil stepped in and asked if the other demons wouldn't mind if he gave it a try, so the demons gladly obliged. The devil said to the demons, "What you are doing is too simple. Stand back and watch how it is done." The devil then walked up to the monk, leaned into his ear, and quietly whispered, "Your brother has just been named the Bishop of Alexandria." And just like that, the monk turned green with envy, and jealousy took over his heart. The devil then turned to the demons and said, "That's how you do it." With the sin of envy, there's always this comparison. And when we compare ourselves with others, the other person has something that we want. In the parable of the workers in the vineyard, the first-hour worker compared himself with the last-hour worker, and what the last-hour worker that the first-hour worker wanted was more than he deserved. With the sin of envy, there's always a comparison, and that's where the trouble begins. There's an author by the name of John Acuff. He said, "Don't compare your beginning to someone else's middle. Don't compare your middle to someone else's end. Don't compare the start of your second quarter to someone else's third quarter." The Apostle Paul said, "Make a careful exploration of who you are and the work you've been given, and then sink yourself into that. Don't be impressed with yourself. Don't compare yourself with others. Each of you must take responsibility for doing the creative best you can with your own life." Galatians chapter 6. The parable of the workers in the vineyard also shows us that those who suffer from the sin of envy also lack joy. At the end of the day, when the first-hour worker saw that the last-hour worker got paid as if he had worked all day, he was unable to be happy for him, and that's because he expected more. He expected a little extra. The first-hour worker compared himself to the last-hour worker and felt completely cheated, but that was not the case. Teddy Roosevelt once said, "Comparison is the thief of joy." And we often see that when it comes to the sin of envy. There's a famous story told about two shopkeepers who were bitter rivals. Their stores were across the street from one another, and they spent their days standing in the doorway, keeping track of who had more customers. If one of them got a customer, he would smile in triumph at the other. So one night, an angel appeared to one of the shopkeepers and said, "God has sent me to teach you a lesson. He will give you anything you ask for, but your competitor across the street will get twice as much. So, would you like wealth? Ask what you will, only he will get twice as much. Do you want a long and happy life? It's yours, but he will live twice as long. You can be famous. Your children can be famous. Whatever you wish. But whatever you get, he will get twice as much." The man frowned and thought for a moment, and finally he said, "All right, my request is this: strike me blind in one eye." That's what the sin of envy will do, even if it costs you pain, knowing that your competitor will hurt twice as much. I came across this Peanuts cartoon, which I thought was interesting. If you could put it on the screen. Charlie Brown and Linus are sitting underneath a tree when, out of the blue, Linus says to Charlie Brown, "Pain looks great on other people." That's actually a Peanuts cartoon. Charles Schulz came up with that. I don't know the full context of this cartoon, but it reminds me of the German concept of Schadenfreude. You know of this? It's when you take joy in other people's misery. So, what is the saving virtue when it comes to the sin of envy? Every one of the 7 deadly sins has a corresponding virtue, and for envy, the saving virtue is kindness. We resist the temptation of envy by engaging in acts of kindness, and that kindness comes from our love of God. The Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, "Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud." Love does not envy. Love is kind. Kindness is the saving virtue when it comes to the sin of envy. Jesus was once asked, "What is the greatest commandment?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and a second one is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." To love our neighbor is the opposite of envying them. To show kindness to others is how we avoid being envious of them. I'm glad you got paid a full day's wage, even though you were only able to work just a few hours. Those are kind words. I'm glad your business is going well, even in this economy. I'm glad you got that promotion. I'm glad you have a Technicolor Dreamcoat. I'm glad you got a brand new car. I'm glad your kids are getting straight A's. Be glad when you see God's blessings upon others, for that is how we honor God. And remember that God has already given to each of us more than we need, more than we deserve. And if we have to work longer or harder than others, we give thanks to God, for God saw us worthy to serve. And all God's people said, Amen. Our prayer of confession over the sin of envy, it was a little bit too long to include in the bulletins, and so we have it on screen. I'd like to invite all of you to now come together and confess our sin of envy. Lord, your word says love is patient and kind. Your word tells us that love does not envy, that it does not boast, and that it is not proud. Your word says that love is not rude and that it is not self-seeking. Your word tells us that love is not easily angered and that it keeps no record of wrongs. Your word says that love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth, that it always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres.